hour of debate that has been budgeted for the bigger question, the motion to vacate, the motion, the next vote, which would be to oust Kevin McCarthy. I'm not a betting man. If I were a betting man, though, Lily, I'd put the mortgage on the bet that this is going to be more than an hour, that they're going to go well beyond the estimated time frame for this debate. Both Speaker McCarthy and the House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries are given unlimited budgets of time to speak during floor debates. And it would be surprised if we didn't hear from one or both of them during this hour. The man you're hearing from, sitting next to Matt Gaetz, or standing next to Matt Gaetz, is Virginia Congressman Bob Good, a House Freedom Caucus member from Central Virginia. He has been among the most ardent opponents of Kevin McCarthy this Congress. He never voted in favor of Kevin McCarthy's speakership. He has towed almost as hard a line as Matt Gaetz has. So these remarks coming from Bob Good will not be a surprise. They will be critical of McCarthy. They will call for the ouster of Kevin McCarthy.
I want to bring in and join this panel Nicole Killian. Nicole, talk to us about what we saw just there in terms of the voting. All of the Democrats voted against tabling this motion. Basically, as Scott put it, if this is a practice run, we would count on every Democrat voting to oust Kevin McCarthy. So talk to us about what the tone, what the mood has been, and what's in it for Democrats in Congress to get rid of McCarthy.
Well, Democrats made clear coming out of their caucus meeting this morning that they were going to be unified. Time and again, that was the message that emanated from various members. And they basically said that they intended to stick together. So to your point, if we see this motion to vacate go forward, now that this vote to table it has failed, meaning they will try to move forward with this vote, then it is not a good sign for Speaker Kevin McCarthy. But that being said, you know, Speaker McCarthy likes to look at the glass half full. And, you know, this kind of takes us back to right where we were in January, where we went through those 15 rounds. And I really feel like people at home are probably seeing what I saw on midnight. I think it was Saturday, on early in January, where, you know, you're just seeing this live and in person as they debate whether the speaker should stay or go. And we heard a lot of these same arguments earlier this year. We're likely to hear more of them now. But I think from the viewpoint of Democrats, that is why they're kind of hanging together on this one. And they hung together in early January as well, but primarily because they feel that this is of Republicans' own doing, and they need to figure this out for themselves.
So, Nicole, do you think that there's any candidates for speakership that Democrats in Congress would stand behind?
I think it remains to be seen. I mean, certainly some of the names we've heard floated are some of the current Republican leaders, deputies to Speaker Kevin McCarthy, whether that's Majority Leader Steve Scalise or GOP Whip Tom Emmer. But obviously, you know, they work very closely with Speaker McCarthy, so unclear if their leadership would be any different if they were to be elected. But again, pretty premature to make those kinds of predictions until we kind of see how these procedures play out.
Well, I want to play out a little bit of the debate that's going on there. Let's take a listen.
That was the limit, save, grow levels, radically, historically, saving $100 billion and lowering the deficit this year under Republican majority from $2.2 trillion to $2.1 trillion. That's what we were asking the Republican House to do, to go to $2.1 trillion. Meanwhile, the Speaker had committed to bring a balanced budget vote to this floor, something that still has not happened, despite the work that's been done in our budget committee to mark it up and have it ready to come to the floor. He also promised that we would bring all 12 appropriation bills well before the September 30 fiscal deadline. We did not. We simply, as Republicans, needed the Speaker to cast the vision, request the support of the entire conference, all of whom voted for the limit, save, grow levels, except for 4 who wanted to go even further, to lead us in joining him, sticking with him, supporting him, and sending the most conservative spending bills with the most conservative cuts possible to the Senate as the best starting position for negotiations with the Senate. Many of us begged and pleaded with the Speaker to do that over the past 5 months. When the Speaker failed us to pass our spending bills, bringing only 1 of 12 to the floor, before the August district work period, members began to negotiate amongst themselves without the Speaker to find compromise. I was among those who reluctantly agreed last month to split the difference between failed responsibilities 1.586 and the limit save grow 1.471. I reluctantly agreed to do that, to go to 1.526 in order to pass our bills on to the Senate. We then essentially forced the Speaker, with the pressure of the calendar, the debt ceiling, or excuse me, the shutdown threat of the calendar, to bring those 4 bills to the floor last week, all of which I voted for, despite some of them not cutting to the levels we'd agreed to and other concerns I had with the bills. I reluctantly voted for the 30-day conditional CR, or continuing resolution, because it cut an additional $10 billion in the month of October, going back to the pre-COVID 1.471 levels for defense, non-defense discretionary, 30%, and it had border security. I voted for that. However, when that vote failed, the Speaker this past Friday in the Republican conference meeting made it abundantly clear that he was willing to do anything to avoid the temporary discomfort and the pressure of a pause in the 15% of the non-essential federal government operations, which would guarantee that we would lose to the Senate Democrats and the White House. If you're not willing to say no, then you're guaranteed to lose. And that was confirmed with the passage of the unconditional 45-day CR this past Saturday, once again with 209 Democrat votes. The Republican bill, 209-1 Democrats, 51-0 in the Senate side. The Speaker fought through 15 votes in January to become Speaker, but was only willing to fight through one failed CR before surrendering to the Democrats on Saturday. We need a Speaker who will fight for something, anything, besides just staying or becoming Speaker. If there was ever a time to fight, with $33 trillion in national debt, a $2 trillion deficit this year, 40-year high inflation, 20-year high interest rates, a downgraded credit rating, and for the first time in modern history, the polls showing, despite all the help of the media blaming Republicans in the House, the polls showed that the public was blaming Biden and the Democrats for an imminent shutdown. If not fight now, when would we fight? Now is and was the time. With the Democrats driving the fiscal bus off the cliff at 100 miles an hour, we cannot simply be content to be the party that slows it down to 95 just so we can sit in the front seat and wear the captain's hat. Our current debt and our spending trajectory is unsustainable. We need a Speaker, ideally somebody who doesn't want to be Speaker and hasn't pursued that at all costs for his entire adult life, who will meet the moment and do everything possible to fight for the country. A red line was crossed for me, I regret, on Saturday, and chose regret that I must vote against the motion to table as I did and to vote to vacate the chair. And I yield back.
Gentleman from Florida reserves his time. Gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I share one thing in common with my friend from Virginia. This is a very sad day, and certainly a day I never expected to have to live through. You know, I think broadly speaking, as I look across this floor, you can divide members into 3 groups. I'm very happy to be in the first group. The overwhelming majority of my party supports.
Okay, we have been listening to members of Congress debate why members of the GOP, especially those from the Freedom Caucus, are voting or against a resolution that House Speaker Kevin McCarthy put forward to essentially save his seat after the representative from Florida, Matt Gaetz, filed a resolution to oust him from power. I want to bring in Scott McFarland, who has been breaking this all down for us. Scott, we are living in a time where the polarization in Congress and across the country is impossible to ignore. At a time when, even though democracy is something that does not signify the rule of the few, it seems like the loudest are the ones that are able to do things like what we're seeing right now happen and disrupt the whole process. I'd love to go back to January a little bit and for you to explain to us from where you stand and what you've witnessed, how this small group of far-right Republicans have impacted the way politics has played out during this entire year and just the inability to get to a compromise, which is what happens in a democracy.
Lilia, this feels so similar to what we watched hour after hour in that chamber in January. It has so many echoes of what we witnessed because it is a fundamental fight, not just over whether Kevin McCarthy should be Speaker, but a fight inside the Republican Party over what to do with the power of the majority in the U.S. House. Same voices making symmetrical arguments. It feels as if this day was a destination the House Republicans were always headed toward. The vote was so narrow, and the vote took so long in January to elect Kevin McCarthy Speaker, and the opposition inside his own party was so vibrant and vitriolic at times, it felt like this day was coming, just a matter of when. And you heard Congressman Good of Virginia, who's been, again, the most strident or among the most strident McCarthy critics among Republicans, say he's criticizing the deals, the agreements Kevin McCarthy, he says, reached to avert the government shutdown, and some Republicans are concerned about the deal he cut with the White House to avert the debt ceiling crisis. But that's what you've been hearing this week. As this vote was being prepared, concern about agreements or deals and a lack of transparency from Kevin McCarthy, according to his fellow Republicans. Yesterday, Congressman Gaetz of Florida, who was seated next to Mr. Good and who was the one who introduced this motion, was criticizing what he said was some secret deal cut between Speaker McCarthy and the White House over future funding to help Ukraine in its war effort. McCarthy told me there was no secret deal. There was no deal cut with the White House. But it's those agreements that they allege and that they seem to be holding as issues as they move toward this ultimate vote, potentially to oust McCarthy. It's also not clear, as this day develops, who the alternative would be. There's been no consensus as to who is Plan B. Who would stand in if Kevin McCarthy were forced to stand down? That's always been the leverage Kevin McCarthy wields. It was in January when he won on the 15th vote, when we watched a scene just like this. There was no reasonable or conceivable alternative that could get the votes of a majority of House members. That same dynamic exists right now, and maybe how Kevin McCarthy can bounce back from whatever happens next.
So we're going to go back in there to listen to Matt Gaetz, who's the person that initiated, who triggered this vote to oust McCarthy. Let's listen to what he has to say.
House Democrats and many of us on the conservative side of the Republican caucus would argue is that the thing we have in common, Kevin McCarthy said something to all of us at one point or another that he didn't really mean and never intended to live up to. I don't think voting against Kevin McCarthy is chaos. I think $33 trillion in debt is chaos. I think that facing a $2.2 trillion annual deficit is chaos. I think that not passing single subject spending bills is chaos. I think the fact that we have been governed in this country since the mid-90s by continuing resolution and omnibus is chaos. And the way to liberate ourselves from that is a series of reforms to this body that I would hope would outlast Speaker McCarthy's time here, would outlast my time here, and would outlast either of our majorities. Reforms that I have heard some of the most conservative members of this body fight for, and some of the reforms that we've been battling for that I've even heard those in the Democrat caucus say would be worthy and helpful to the House, like open amendments, like understanding what the budget is. We have been out of compliance with budget laws for most of my life, most of many of your lives. And by the way, if we did those things, if we had single subject bills, if we had an understanding on the top line, if we had open amendments, if we had trust and honesty and understanding, there would be times when my conservative colleagues and I would lose, might be a few times when we'd win. There'd be times that we would form partnerships that might otherwise not be really predictable in the American body politic, but the American people would see us legislating. These last few days, we've suspended the momentum that we had established the week earlier, where we were bringing bills to the floor, voting on them, staying late at night, working hard. That's what the American people expect. It's something Speaker McCarthy hasn't delivered, and that's why I've moved to vacate the chair. I reserve.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to my very good friend, Mr. Emmer from Minnesota.
Gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Emmer, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Kevin McCarthy has earned this. Under Speaker McCarthy's leadership, our House Republican majority has actually defied all odds and overperformed expectations again and again and again. It all started with a speaker's race, when our Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, showed the American people how he would never give up. It carried over into the Speaker spearheading a rules package to create the most transparent, member-driven legislative process that I've ever seen since I've been here. And since then, Speaker McCarthy's Republican majority has been successful in bringing common sense back to our nation's capital by passing legislation to affirm a parent's right to be involved in their child's education, bolster American energy production, fully fund veterans' care and benefits, fight back against the regulatory state, and continue delivering on our promise to rein in Democrats' reckless spending by passing fiscally responsible appropriations bills. We've also achieved historic conservative wins, like passing the strongest border security legislation in history, passing the first Republican-only NDAA.
You have been listening to a debate among members of the House of Representatives, those who support Kevin McCarthy's speakership and those who fiercely oppose it and are trying to remove him from that seat. I want to bring in CBS News congressional correspondent Nicole Killion. Nicole, we just heard Matt Gaetz, who is the person who filed that resolution, who triggered this vote that's now being debated on. Talk to us about what is it that Matt Gaetz is trying to achieve. What I heard from him is a message about a need for an entire overhaul of the way that voting happens in Congress. So talk to us about specifically what led to this point and what, from your perspective, is he trying to achieve?
Well, at the end of the day, he thinks that Speaker McCarthy has gone back on his word to conservatives and to uphold conservative principles. And you heard him there say that I don't think voting against Kevin McCarthy is chaos. I think $33 trillion in debt is chaos. You know, he talked about the fact that, you know, Congress so often has been doing these continuing resolutions instead of passing their appropriations bills, saying that that is chaos. You know, he believes that legislation should be single subject, just focusing on one piece of policy instead of looping a bunch of issues together. He thinks that is chaos. So he has called for a number of reforms, basically, in how the House and Congress operates. And so that is his argument. He feels that the Speaker has failed to deliver, not only in upholding some of the promises that he made, but in just helping to carry out the business of Congress. You know, again, a lot of the gripes that some Republicans had, and you heard this a bit from Bob Good as well, it kind of goes back to most recently that debt limit deal that was struck between the Speaker and the White House. So, you know, many conservative Republicans feel that the Speaker gave up too much and that he really didn't fight hard enough to really hold the line on spending levels. And so that's kind of, this fight has resurrected now in this appropriations process, because during that debt limit fight, of course, one of the compromises was that both chambers needed to move back to what's called regular order, where they passed the 12 appropriations bills to fund various agencies in the government. And again, that process is underway. But as you heard some members say, we're behind the 8 ball here. We should have been further along with this. That was the Speaker's job, and we're not there yet. And that's part of why we ended up in the fight over the temporary spending bill last week, because they needed that stopgap to be able to finish their work with respect to appropriations. So just on multiple levels, many of these hardliners feel that the Speaker really hasn't lived up to his worth in terms of how they feel he should conduct himself, not only in governing, but also serving as the leader of House Republicans. Now, you also heard from Congressman Tom Cole, who heads Rules, who called this a very sad day. You also heard from GOP Whip Tom Emmer, who is a deputy of Speaker McCarthy, tried to tout what he feels are the accomplishments that the Speaker has made in terms of having a more transparent rules package and in terms of promoting the agenda of House Republicans, you know, which stems from this long commitment to America blueprint that House Republicans laid out in the last election, you know, on issues of border security and parents' rights and increasing energy production and cutting regulation, all those priorities. You know, you heard Whip Emmer say, you know, the Speaker has been trying to deliver. So this is that push and pull, that argument that you were hearing from members both for the Speaker and against the Speaker as they try to debate whether or not he should stay in his job.
And on that, I want to go back in there to listen to Freedom Caucus member, to Representative Jim Jordan from Ohio, part of these hardliners that you're saying, and listen to why he wants Speaker McCarthy out.
January 3rd, frankly, that entire week. He has kept his word. I think we should keep him as Speaker. I yield back.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Yeah, the problem with my friend from Ohio's argument is that many of the bills he referenced as having passed are not law. We are on a fast track to an omnibus bill, and it is difficult to champion oversight when House Republicans haven't even sent a subpoena to Hunter Biden. So it's hard to make the argument that oversight is the reason to continue when it sort of looks like failure theater. I yield such time as he may consume to my colleague from Arizona, Mr. Bates.
Gentleman from Arizona is recognized. How much time?
What he consumes.
So much as he may consume.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a serious time. And my mind immediately goes to the young deputy from Cochise County who 2 nights ago, while trying to apprehend a runaway vehicle smuggling humans across the border, suffered major injuries, transported to Pima County, where he's in a Tucson hospital fighting for his life. I'm talking about a border that remains wide open, where drugs come through the Tucson sector, the most gotaways known and unknown of any sector along the border. Terrorists coming in. People conducting criminal conduct coming in, criminal gang members, human smugglers, sex traffickers. They're coming across our border to the tune of hundreds of thousands every month. Now, I appreciate my colleagues and their position, but I would suggest something. I don't think you can just skip to last weekend and say, oh my goodness, a CR came out last weekend on Saturday. I think we need to go back to January. I'll say this. This body came together on the Republican side, and we passed a good border security piece of legislation, H.R. 2. That's good. And then last week we passed the DHS bill and the DOD bills, which had funding for our CBP, ICE, military leaders, military men and women. But why?
For more on this debate around ousting Speaker Kevin McCarthy from his seat as Speaker of the House, I want to bring in CBS News congressional correspondent Scott McFarland. Scott, talk to us about the significance of that compromise, of that moment when this becomes an option. You've said over and over today this is a historic moment if Speaker McCarthy is effectively ousted. 2 questions for you. What happens if they essentially vote him out? Who becomes Speaker? Immediately in the interim, what happens next? And how has the ability of any member of Congress to call a vote to remove him impacted his leadership and the way things have been negotiated in the House?
Yeah, Lilia, if there is a vote to vacate the speakership, if he is ousted from the speakership today, the House administrators will unfurl a playbook that has a lot of dust on it because it's never been used before. There is a continuity of Congress document that names a speaker fill-in or a speaker designate to hold the job until there's a new speaker vote. That name is predetermined. It's just not a public list, so people don't know who it is. But that's a placeholder until they can have a new set of votes on who the next speaker is to be. And Kevin McCarthy is not precluded for running for the job again. We could see a true repeat of what we watched happen here in January, a multi-round vote in which Kevin McCarthy has a kernel of Republican support, and when he has some dissenters he may need to win over. That he won over those dissenters in January is critical here, because one of the things he gave them was the capability, with a single member, to have a motion to oust him from his job. The previous speaker, Nancy Pelosi, didn't have that rule. The rules were changed in prior years to make a higher threshold where you needed more people to want to oust a speaker to even have the vote to do so. Kevin McCarthy, as part of his negotiations with this same group, which is moving against him today, his negotiations with them gave him a concession that any one member, today it's Matt Gaetz, can move to challenge his job. That's why so much of this felt as it was predestined, that this type of vote was coming at some point. Today is that point.
To what degree or to what extent can Matt Gaetz achieve the kind of overhaul that he was describing throughout those speeches? I mean, he keeps talking about single subject funding bills to essentially change the way that the Congress votes. He seems to want to change a lot of things and make massive changes there. Is he just trying to make a point for his voters? Is he trying to really inspire other members of Congress to join him in this fight? I mean, even Jim Jordan stood there and was supporting McCarthy. So it's not all hardliners, but just a small few that are supporting the ousting of the speaker. What needs to happen for there to be some order in the next 45 days that the government is set to remain open?
Now, let me unpack a couple of those questions. The first one is critical. What is Matt Gaetz's goal, and is he achieving it? Matt Gaetz's critics would say one of his goals is always to get a lot of attention, raise a lot of money, and cut a high profile. Well, he has certainly accomplished that mission over the past 24 hours. He has been surrounded by cameras and questions and people who want to talk to him and give him a platform. That much he's accomplished, and he could mobilize this to raise his profile further if he wanted to, potentially to raise some money. His longer-term goal that he says is being executed today is to make what comes out of the U.S. House more conservative, more in line with Republican conservative principles, less spending, a more ardent following of the House procedures, none of those continuing resolutions or sweeping bills to keep the government open while the other business still waits. It's hard to see how this furthers that goal because ultimately, everything that comes out of the U.S. House, and Matt Gaetz or anybody who wants to become law, needs to be signed off on and agreed to by the Senate, which is controlled by Democrats. It needs to be signed by President Biden. And if nothing else, Kevin McCarthy has, at least through the first 9 months of his speakership, been able to make deals that have been acceptable to the Senate and acceptable to the White House. And Kevin McCarthy would say that in some of those deals, though conservatives don't like them all, he's managed to salvage some Republican priorities. Whoever the next speaker would be, assuming there is a motion to vacate that's successful later today, may have to find a different political composition of Republicans to support him. If they're more conservative, if the speaker has to be more conservative, it doesn't change the fundamentals. Democrats control the Senate, and certainly Democrats in the White House.
The way you govern, the way a democracy works is through compromise. If Speaker McCarthy is ousted, if he's voted out, somebody else comes in. These hardliners, if they're on that person's side, might stop calling on another vote to oust that person. But it seems to me like this is a pattern that was established in January that has created a great deal of instability. How do you undo that? How do you get people to compromise in Congress? And I know that you don't have a crystal ball, but maybe do you see this compromise that he gave to keep his speakership being undone?
No, the overwhelming majority of Republicans in the U.S. House support Kevin McCarthy, and you saw it in that vote. Only 11 defected, which means approximately 200 plus were sticking with Kevin McCarthy and like the way he's led, or at least are supportive of the way he's led. I want to just give you some guidance as to what you're seeing. You've seen speakers. You saw Congressman Biggs a few moments ago. You see Congressman Cole, a supporter of Kevin McCarthy, speaking there. But don't assume the people surrounding these speakers are of one party. Sometimes there are Democrats sitting behind Republicans or Republicans sitting behind Democrats. But what we've watched so far in this proposed hour-long debate about Kevin McCarthy has been exclusively Republican members speaking. Democrats are keeping their powder dry. They have nothing to say on this matter right now because, as the House leader has alleged, this is a Republican civil war. And Republicans right now are having an argument amongst themselves. Doesn't mean the Democrats won't speak before this is all over. And I'll note this, because I think it might be important as this hour proceeds, Lilia. During any House floor debate, the Republican leader, Speaker, the Democratic leader, Hakeem Jeffries of New York, have unlimited time to talk. They're not bound by time restraints as other members are. So if Kevin McCarthy wants to get out there on the floor and make his case, they're not going to ring the bell and stop him when the hour is up. If Hakeem Jeffries wants to say his piece, they're not going to ring the bell and stop him when the hour is up. But based on the early trajectory of this debate, this is going to be an overwhelming, if not exclusive, Republican speech after Republican speech, a Republican debate about the future of their conference, and at this moment, the future of the House Speaker.
Do you see Speaker McCarthy getting up there and making his case and debating on his own behalf and perhaps trying to lure those 10 or 11 representatives who voted against him to this point, to this latest vote, to not vote against him again when the big one comes?
Now, it's hard to imagine one of those Hollywood movie speeches on the House floor that can change the minds of 11 Republicans who did something as provocative as they did today. An historic first step towards potentially ousting the Speaker of the House in their own party. Whatever concessions or leverage Kevin McCarthy tries to wield to win votes, likely done behind closed doors. That's what happened in January. I asked the House Speaker, just as he entered the chamber today, did you offer anything to anyone? Make any concessions or make any deals to win votes? I asked him the question twice. He didn't answer. Third question I asked, are you optimistic about this vote? And he said yes. But it's hard to conceive of a speech he could give that would change the hearts and minds of 11 people who've done something so bold. And I'll also note this. These proceedings have a different look than most House proceedings. If you're here most days of the week, you don't see what you see on the screen now. They don't have every seat filled. They don't have perfect attendance or near perfect attendance. Usually it's a very sparse population inside the U.S. House. This is so reminiscent of what we watched in January, and we watched it for hours. I sat in that chair for hours in January watching the Speaker debate. Every seat was filled because every vote is critical on this matter. And there was a text message sent out yesterday, Lilia, to House Democratic chiefs of staff saying, make sure your bosses, make sure the members in the Democratic caucus are at a maximum a walk away from the House floor at all times indefinitely. They need a good head count. They want to make sure everybody's here because some of these votes could have a very narrow margin.
I want to bring in CBS News congressional correspondent Nicole Killion back into this conversation. Nicole, so what are these proceedings that, as Scott described, where we can't look away from, and we probably won't for the foreseeable future? What is this all taking attention away from, a month and a half away from the moment that we could face another possible government shutdown, or the possibility, another possibility of a government shutdown?
Well, that's really the argument that a lot of moderate Republicans in particular are making, and allies of the Speaker. Look, we have actual work to do. We really shouldn't be spending our time, wasting our time on a distraction like this. Again, to your point, they just barely passed a short-term bill to fund the government for the next 45 days. So A, they got to figure that out. B, they've got to pass these dozen appropriations bills to fund the government on a longer-term basis. Now, the House is a little further along in their process than the Senate, but this is going to be a grind because we know both of those chambers have two different sets of appropriations bills. While they may fund the same agencies like the Pentagon and, the Department of Homeland Security, et cetera, House Republicans have attached some controversial amendments to some of those appropriations bills that aren't going to fly in the Senate. So they've got to work that out with the Senate. Again, got 45 days to do this and to get this all done. On top of that, as we know, the president's pretty upset because this temporary funding package did not include any money for Ukraine. And the White House has said, we don't have enough money to cover them over the next 45 days. And so you need to get on that. You need to hurry up and pass additional funding. Now, there is some back and forth, and this has angered people like Matt Gaetz because he accuses the Speaker, for instance, of cutting this secret side deal with Biden to provide more funding for Ukraine, which many Republican members in the House oppose, although there are some certainly who do support additional aid. The Speaker has denied any kind of side deal. And even though the president on Sunday seemed to suggest and say that there was a deal, the White House has kind of since walked that back. So, look, the bottom line is they do have a lot that they have to get done in a short period of time. And so many of these members see this as a distraction. And, you know, we have to see how this all plays out. But I would say, by and large, the vast majority of the GOP conference wants to move on. And that's also part of the reason why this is happening now. Obviously, we know that Congressman Matt Gaetz filed this motion to vacate just last night. Technically speaking, the House had up to 2 days to hold a vote. But the Speaker decided to move forward with this vote. And I asked him earlier, I said, well, are you calling Gaetz's bluff? And he basically said yes. You know, I think he was confident enough that, look, if we can get past this, then we can move on to the business of governing, as he puts it. But obviously, looks like he could be in a bit of trouble. And again, we'll have to see how this ultimately plays out.
That's right. And now, after that, we're here. A vote might be coming. We're going to take a short break, but we are going nowhere. We're going to then come back and listen to more of this debate, and it's possible that there might be a vote to come later today to oust Kevin McCarthy from his speakership position. Stay with us.
Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, there is nothing sober, wise, or cautious about
When weather turns extreme, CBS News and the Weather Channel bring you virtual weather technology so advanced, so real, you'll have time to get prepared. Feel the forecast. Weather when it matters most on CBS Mornings.
An original documentary from CBS reports
that Desired Farm is a wonderful place to raise children, and it still is.
Promises broken.
Black American